today the impact of colonialism on the countries which suffered because of it, in other terms, on the colonies. Before discussing the impact, I would like to remind you that we had discussed two terms. One was the colonial power and the other one was the colony. And I told you that, let's say, the colonial powers were basically from Europe. For example, one example could be the Britishers, which came to India and they colonized India. So in this case, the colony was India. So I'll be using these two terms very often in this discussion. That is why I thought of reminding you of these two terms and the difference between them. Remember, colonial powers and the colonies which they colonize. So what was the impact of colonialism? And we are basically looking at the impact from the point of view of the colonies. First thing was that the colonial powers tried to exert full political control over their colonies, which means that they didn't only try to exploit these colonies economically, but they also tried to control all the affairs of these colonies. We will take up the example of India very often because you have all read about our colonial past when you were under the British colonial rule, and you would be able to relate to the examples much easier. So that is why I'll be referring during this particular discussion to Indian examples and to our experience during our subjugation by the British colonial empire. So the example could be India, and when India was under the British colonial rule, the political control was also exercised by the Britishers. How? You would remember that during those times, even the law making, whatever law had to be made, whatever laws had to be formulated for the country, for the India, they were also made by and approved by the Britishers, which means they had full political control over us. Plus, what kind of relationships we could have with our neighboring countries, that was also defined by our colonial bosses, the British Empire. You would remember that not only this, they also demarcated the border between India and China, which you know by McMahon Line. You know it as McMahon Line. So it was demarcated not by the Indians themselves, but by the Britishers, without taking into consideration the opinion of the people here in India. So this is the extent to which the colonial powers used to exercise their control over even the political affairs of the colonies. Again, subjugation of indigenous population was rampant. What do we mean by subjugation? Subjugation means bringing the colony population under their rule, exploiting them, causing hardships to them, and this was rampant in colonies, not only in India but in other colonies also. We have in the last discussion we have seen how slave trade was used by the colonial powers. They used to bring in indigenous people from the colonies, original inhabitants of the colonies, as slave to work with them in their plantations or to work with them in their mines, and this took the form of slave trades. These people were not paid anything. So this was the kind of inhuman treatment which was meted out to the people in their colonies. If you take example of India, you would remember that there was no right to protest was granted to Indian citizens, and there were so many Indian revolutionaries who protested against the British colonial rule, and they were imprisoned and many times they were even hanged. So this was the level of subjugation of indigenous population by the colonial powers, and this was not something peculiar or specific to India. This was across the colonies. So whichever colonial power you talk about, whichever colony you talk about, you would find that the colonial powers resorted to use of force, use of violence to subjugate, to bring the indigenous people of those colonies under their control and to exploit them. we had seen that the main objective behind colonialism was the economic exploitation of resources of the colonies, and this was one thing which impacted the economy of the colonies also. It is said that around 1500, when India was still under the Mughal dynasty's rule, India's contribution to world trade was almost 25%. By the time the Britishers left us in 1947, our contribution to the international trade reduced to less than 1%. So this was the kind of economic exploitation that we were forced to undergo. And this was the case with all the colonies. So it is not something which is peculiar to India only, it was the case with all the colonies. In many of the colonies, the colonial powers used to incur quite a significant amount of money to administer those colonies, and they used to extract that money from the colonies themselves. In India also, for example, whatever money was spent in the administration of the country by the British colonial power, that money was extracted from India only, and for that they levied very high land revenue on the peasants and also on the various industries that were functioning in India at that point of time. So this was the kind of economic exploitation that the colonies had to face under the colonial rule. Again, the economic exploitation also took shape of environmental degradation. Actually, the colonial powers tried to extract as much as possible from their colonies, and ultimately what happened was that it led to degradation of environment in the colonies. You can take examples of pine plantation that you can find here in Uttarakhand, the cheed forest that you find here in Uttarakhand. See, cheed is not a species which is naturally found in these parts. It was actually planted by the British colonial powers. Why? Because they needed wood to construct railway lines and to build railway wagons, and for that the pine wood is considered to be a good material, and that is why they planted pine trees in many parts of the state of Uttarakhand. At that point of time, of course, we were not Uttarakhand and we were part of the United Province. So these kind of forests were planted here, these kind of trees were planted here, and now you can see that ultimately these trees are not good for the local ecology. The reason is that they do not allow water to be retained in the soil. They also do not allow the vegetation to grow in their vicinity, in their surrounding. So you would not find too many shrubs or herbs or creepers growing in the vicinity of a pine tree. And plus, apart from that, they are more prone to forest fires. So just because the Britishers tried to exploit us economically, they tried to obtain as much as pine wood possible so that they can construct their railway lines and they can lay down the railway tracks and they can also construct the railway wagons. We are still facing the impact almost 70-80 years after we attained our freedom from the British colonial rule. So this is the kind of economic exploitation which resulted into environmental degradation in the colonies. And this was, again, I'm reiterating myself that this is not something that was peculiar to India. We are only taking an example of India so that we can easily relate to it. It was rampant throughout the world. Wherever the colonies existed, they were economically exploited, which ultimately led to degradation of the local ecology. Human rights violations were also rampant under colonialism. Human rights violations, I have also referred to them a little while ago. For example, in India, people did not have the right to protest. In fact, one Rowlatt Act was passed in 1919 in which the people could be apprehended without any proof, and they didn't have the luxury to go to a lawyer and to fight their case in the court. And in fact, it was at that point of time said about the Rowlatt Act, na appeal, na vakil, na dalil. So once you are apprehended under the Rowlatt Act, you cannot go for any appeal in a court of law. You cannot justify that you cannot give away any explanation, and you cannot defend yourself also, and you cannot even go to a lawyer. So this was the kind of human right violations that were rampant during the colonial rule. In so many places, the farmers were evicted from their land just because they were not able to pay revenue because of low crop yield. And this was done without any consideration to their livelihood or to their well-being. So this was the kind of human right violations which were rampant in the colonies. Again, one impact of the colonialism was the spread of Christianity in so many different parts of the world which were colonized by the colonial powers. You would remember that most of the colonial powers, except for Japan, which emerged as a colonial power around 1880s, 90s, most of the colonial powers were basically from Europe, and the predominant religion at that point of time in Europe, and still is, Christianity. So, colonial powers didn't only colonize the various colonies, but they also tried to spread Christianity in these colonies. For that, they sent their missionaries also, and you can still find the traces of these kind of missionary presences across the country. In fact, some of the missionaries did some good work also. For example, they set up schools, and they set up hospitals also. You know about missionaries of charity. So these were all missionaries who were basically sent by the British colonial powers so that they can spread the Christian religion, Christian denomination. However, the main objective, though these missionaries in many places did some really good job also for the upliftment of the local population, the indigenous population, the original inhabitants of the place, of the colonies, but then the main objective, however, in the beginning, behind sending these missionaries, these Christian missionaries, was to spread Christianity and to spread this religion at the cost of other religions which were followed by the original inhabitants of the colonies, which were followed by the people living in the colonies. Again, one more positive impact of colonialism on the colonies was that the colonies and the people of the colonies, they were exposed to modern education and scientific thinking. However, this was not deliberately done by the colonial powers. The colonial powers only wanted people who could help them in running their administration. For example, even in India, the British colonial power, it basically wanted to have clerks so that they can run their administration. Because they could have brought the viceroys from Britain, they could have brought the district magistrates from Britain, but they could not have brought the clerks, they could not have brought peons, they could not have brought these petty kind of workers from Britain. So what did they do and what did they plan? They thought that they will try and spread education, modern education, so that they would be able to create a significant number of they would be able to have significant number of people who could help them in carrying out the administration in their colonies. And that is why they tried to spread modern education and scientific thought here in India also. And the main objective was to have a well-trained army of clerks so that they can they could help the British colonial powers in running the administration of the country. However, though it was not meant as such by the colonial powers, this spread of modern education and scientific thought in the colonies, it also helped the original inhabitants of those colonies. Many of the people, many of the intellectuals in the colonies, they benefited from this modern education and scientific thought, and then went on to oppose the colonial rules, went on to oppose the exploitation by the colonial powers. I can take an example of Shri Dadabhai Nehruji. You would remember that he was the founding member of Indian National Congress, and also among the first few presidents that Indian National Congress saw. Dadabhai Nehruji was a very learned individual. In fact, he was also the member of parliament in Britain as a representative of the Indian colony. and having benefited from the British education system and having got good training in economics, he went on to write a very well thought out criticism of the British economic rule in India and of the exploitation that the British colonial rulers were rotting on the Indian population. So we can name other intellectuals also. For example, Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru ji, all these people, they were able to obtain training from various institutes in the situated in the countries of Europe, and then later on went on to spearhead the movement against the exploitation by the colonial rule. So, though it was not meant like this by the colonial rulers, ultimately this spread of modern education and scientific thought ultimately also led to widespread opposition against colonial rules in their colonies. So this was the impact of colonialism. We'll be now taking up the case of India specifically, and we'll be talking about how colonialism impacted the Indian economy in the video discussions that we will be that I shall be posting soon. And very soon we'll also be having a test, so please remain prepared for that test. The test will be announced only 24 hours in advance, so you please go through all these material that are being posted on the internet, and please prepare well for the test.